So last week we talked about um, getting in touch with our hearts and learning to listen to our hearts or listen to our intuition or our gut instinct, whatever you want to call it. And we had some really great discussion around that. And so this week I thought I'd talk about why there's that need to, or why sometimes we have that need to get back in touch with our hearts. Because oftentimes as we grow up in life, there or kind of slowly, gradually over time, we lose touch with our hearts. 'Cause if you look at children, it seems like they're just so joyful and running around and amazed at the world. And so that's how we come into life, with just this open joy and awareness and appreciation. And we're very much in touch with our hearts as children. Children, their emotions are just all over. They wear the emotions on their sleeves. They're very in touch with their instinct, with their hearts, and express them very easily. But many of us, as we grow up, at some point we learn not to freely express our emotions, and this can happen at different ages depending on our family life and other circumstances in our lives as we're growing up. I know some people can have very kind of traumatic childhoods and can have very um, can have caregivers who don't provide a very safe, supportive environment in which to grow up. And so some people at a very young age learn that they can't trust the world. And every time they're hurt and wounded, and all of us, every time we're hurt, every time something happens in the world that teaches us that life isn't just all okay, every time that happens, we kind of we get wounded. And every time we're wounded, we tend to kind of close off our heart a little bit more. If that happens over and over again, we start to learn to protect our hearts. We learn that we can't go through life with our hearts wide open and open to everything, because there are painful experiences out there. And so over time, we kind of learn to protect ourselves, close off ourselves, and we develop this shell around ourselves. And that can make it very hard as adults to listen to our emotions and listen to our hearts, because we're so used to not being able to face them. I think this often happens when we're children, when we experience any kind of really strong negative emotions. If it's too much for us to process at the moment, that's when there's this notion of a trauma response can happen. And trauma sounds like a really dramatic word. It doesn't have to be super dramatic. I mean, sometimes it is. Sometimes there's very traumatic experiences, such as childhood abuse. What we typically think of as, the capital T trauma, and those are can be very wounding experiences. But also trauma responses can happen in response to all kinds of less severe events that we don't typically think of as trauma. Um, it can just be little things over time. And I think for me, this kind of happened to me. I mean, I had a very fortunate childhood. My parents were very supportive and loving. And so I made it through childhood, that my early childhood, pretty secure, pretty confident in myself. But then in middle school, that's like I think I experienced a little bit of trauma from my peers, right? Because I was always kind of a weird kid. I never really knew how to fit in, and so the I learned that when I acted myself, I just kind of followed my instincts and said the weird things that I usually say. Kids would make fun of me in middle school, and so I learned to not express myself, because the self that I expressed to my peers was often met with ridicule. And so this happened when I was older in years. So maybe I think mostly in middle school. So probably, I don't know, my early teens, like 10, or I don't know, how old are we in middle school? I'm not sure. Like 13, 14, 15. And so I already had, a pretty, I kind of feel like my emotional core was pretty intact until that point. And so it just kind of made me it taught me just to fear my peers, but not that the world itself was harsh and mean, because I still had that loving, supportive childhood to fall back on. So it just kind of made me withdraw from the world, but it didn't make me doubt my self-worth. From what I hear from other people, especially my other Sangha mates that I studied with, my meditation teacher, and from friends and partners, and from reading on Elephant Journal, I think when people suffer trauma from their primary caregivers, often their response is to think that they start to really question their self-worth, and that can be very damaging throughout, to grow up with that like there with that inherent sense of self-worth being damaged. And so that can be a lot harder to undo that damage. And so someone who suffers that really early childhood trauma um, usually needs a lot of work with some kind of therapy or counseling in order to be able to chisel out that very, very thick layer of shell that forms around when that wounding starts at a very early childhood age. But so I think most of us at some point in life, whether from early childhood or later, we all develop some amount of kind of wounding like that, and shell forming protective response around us. And that that protective shell is what prevents us from hearing our hearts and hearing our intuition. And so I think so when we talk about finding our hearts, the reason we need to do that is from this protective response we learn throughout childhood to protect ourselves. And so we all have some amount of work we need to do to kind of to process through that built up shell and to tap into all those repressed emotions in order to be able to experience new emotions as they arise. So does that make sense what I'm saying? Is everyone, any questions? Is anyone um, is anyone willing to share? We can turn off the recording if you want, but does anyone want to? Well, how about this? It's about 6:30. Why don't we meditate again? And while we're meditating, I invite you all to think about if there's any kind of like childhood wounding that you recognize that you want to talk about. So I know I felt for me it's very therapeutic to kind of talk about that thing, because we're often ashamed of it because we're never taught to think about it. We're never taught to address it. So while we sit in this next meditation, I invite you, well, okay, so don't think about it because we don't want to be thinking while we're meditating, but just have that question present in your subconscious, and then we'll clear our minds and meditate for a while. And then when we come back, we'll see if any inspiration hits you guys. So I'll go first with sharing a little example. And so like I said, these trauma events, they don't have to be very big or even seem that traumatic at the time. Maybe just wound is a better word. It's just that these little incidents that hurt us as we're and teach us to be afraid. So one particular example stands out from in my memory from 7th grade. And one time in my science class, the teacher was late coming to class, so there was a few minutes when all the students were just sitting around. And I can't remember exactly how this conversation started. But I guess a little bit of background information. I was always like one of the geeky kids growing up. So like my friends, we all played video games and role-playing games, and I watched Star Trek and all that kind of traditional geeky stuff. And so at one point, while we were waiting for the teacher to arrive, some of the kids started like crumpling up paper and throwing them back and forth at each other, just like kids do when they're bored. And at one point, someone like threw something towards my table, and I yelled out "incoming" because like I had seen that on a Star Trek show. Or one time, me and my friends were watching Star Trek, and that there's a scene with and they yelled "incoming," and it was like really funny to us for some reason. So I thought it'd be funny to yell us out in the class. But for some reason, like all the students just latched onto that and kept making fun of me for that. And at the time, I just couldn't. I was just perplexed, like why they're making such a big deal about this. I was like, I was really, I didn't understand why they thought it was so funny. But for like weeks after that, they all called me incoming. And so, I mean, this is just like I say, these are like silly little examples, but that had a big that was and that's just one example of like the kind of stuff that happened to me that over time it just taught me that I couldn't be myself around my peers. Like it taught me to hide myself and not say the things that occurred to me to say. And it took me, I mean, I'm still undoing that conditioning that I received. Like I still, when I'm in a group of people that I don't know, I notice myself in adopting that same response. So I learned whenever I'm a new around people, I kind of like I clench up, my abdomen gets really tight, my shoulders get tight, and I try to not say or do anything. I try to just draw as little attention to me as possible because if they don't notice me, then they're not going to make fun of me, right? And so I still notice when I'm in a group of new people, this this reaction still automatically happens to me sometimes. I feel like actually feel my abdomen all clenched up and I noticed myself just kind of frozen and observing everything and trying to not make any movements, literally, like just trying to observe everything until I figure out how I can safely interact with a group. And I'm getting better at it. I'm catching myself and I'm finding myself, I mean, adults aren't really as mean as kids anyway. So, I'm noticing that response really isn't needed as an adult, but it's still there. And so that's just one little example of like these little childhood events that can have a big impact on us and shape how we interact with the world throughout the rest of our lives and how we lose touch with ourselves and lose touch with who we authentically are because of the conditioning that we receive from the world. And so that's my little example. So did anyone not think of anything to share while we were meditating? And if you'd like, if it's more comfortable, I can turn off the recording if you'd rather not have it recorded.